All right, welcome everyone to our Leadership Connection webinar series today, addressing a very important topic, and it's going to be on policy governance. That word might be a little new to some, but I'm sure you're going to learn how to lead the nonprofit in a much better way. We have a special guest today, Dr. Randall Spence, who has not only been part of organizations, but he has also helped many nonprofit organizations to thrive and to be sustainable and to be effective in what they do. I am Dr. Jesus San Pedro. I'm a program director and assistant professor for the Master of Arts in Leadership here in the School of Business Leadership at Mid-America Christian University. My passion is to connect three things. First of all, relevant content, highly capable either speakers or thinkers, and a great audience. An audience that joins not only for this event, but for all the things that we do here at MACU. And we have that passion to equip leaders so they can go and do what they do in the best possible way. And that's the reason why today I'm honored not only to be part of this event, but to host and to moderate together with Dr. Kelly Resemy, who is a program director and associate professor for the MBA program. And on behalf of our university, and specifically our School of Business Leadership, we want to welcome you all to this new edition of our Leadership Connection webinar series. Glad to be here with you, Dr. Resemy, and glad to see your face.
Well, nice to see you. And I share your passion, Dr. San Pedro, for connecting our students and other people in our community with these wonderful world-class leaders in their fields and learning from them. The Leadership Connection is a monthly open space where local and national leaders and international organization leaders and our wonderful guest speakers connect and engage in transformative conversations and leadership topics. Our MACU students, whom I hope are well represented in our attendees, both graduate and undergraduate, local and online, our alumni, faculty, and staff, and leaders from our community, we welcome you, and you all play a very significant role, not only in participating, but also sharing, as this is an opportunity for us to grow as colleagues and friends on these wonderful topics. So we want to equip you on the latest and most relevant topics and share about what makes MACU's leadership model unique and special. Through this webinar series, we bring the world to MACU and take MACU to the world. I want to acknowledge some key ministry leaders and corporate leaders that are with us today. Thank you for coming, and our local leaders and state leaders, and even around the nation, we have had people attend from around the world. So we just thank you for tuning in and on this online conversation. It takes place every third Thursday of the month at noon, so please, at Central Time. So please mark your calendars and engage with us. This is interactive and dynamic. So this is your space to ask questions after our guest today has the opportunity to present. We're all very excited about him being here with us today. And be sure and stay to the end. And for those of you who engage and participate, you're going to be eligible to win a gift.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Kelly. And I want to, before I go ahead and introduce the topic and our guest speaker for today, I want to mention that we at MACU have a wonderful mission that we want to accomplish, and part of that is to create, to collaborate, and to innovate, to solve local and global problems for the glory of God through Jesus Christ and the good of society. So as we pursue that, we at the School of Business Leadership, we equip, yes, leaders that are going to go into the marketplace, business, but at the same time, there's plenty of nonprofit leaders that we get to equip here, people that are going to go and lead ministries, are going to go and lead churches, public administration, people that have a calling to be in the government, people that have a calling to be in higher ed, people that want to make an impact in the community, and they need to know important things. And honestly, in my case, I see policy governance as one of the top 3 topics of nonprofit leadership. In terms of relevance, the other 2, I would say, is the volunteer strategy and maybe fundraising. That's just my observation. So in my experience in the past, I've been part of either being part of nonprofit boards or consulting nonprofit boards or training. I've noticed the impact and the value of the topic that we're about to address when an organization embraces a solid governance model, either Carver or any other model that may be effective. There is always going to be a great impact, especially in the side of sustainability. And I would say here in most schools are normally leaders equipped to be executives, but not necessarily directors or people, or to lead from the board, which have a different taste and sense of what are the key things to accomplish from there. And that's why we're here today. And we are trying to address a topic that impacts the sustainability, the long-term sustainability of organizations. And we have the privilege to then talk today about policy governance. And the topic is leading the nonprofit in a better way. We're going to go through a definition and understanding of policy governance and how it can be utilized in nonprofit organizations, how to distinguish between management and governance and who does what, and also how policy governance can prevent confusion of expectations in leading of nonprofit and result in great focus on the mission. Who's going to talk about this? Well, we have a really special guest today, Dr. Randall Spence, who is an experienced consultant and church administrator. He has a PhD in organizational leadership and a doctorate in ministry studies. He was past president and CEO of Willow Knoll Retirement Community in Middleton, Ohio. And he's currently an executive pastor at Bayside Community Church in Florida. And yes, those of us who are here in Oklahoma are thinking about the nice weather there and the one that we're having today here. And but most of all, he is part of MACU in a way, because he is our current chairman of the board of trustees for Mid-America Christian University. And we're honored to have you here, Dr. Spence, and thank you for this wonderful time that we're about to get into, and welcome and glad to have you here.
Thank you, Dr. Jesus and Dr. Kelly. It's a delight to be with you today. Thank you to each of you who are joining us in what I consider to be a very relevant topic. I was on the campus of MACU last week for our spring board meeting, and I was walking across the parking lot towards Kennedy Hall, and one of the professors called to me, and she said, "I understand that you're doing an upcoming webinar." And then she asked me the question, "On what's your topic?" And I said, "Policy governance." And she kind of screwed up her face and said, "Oh, that's boring." But then she went on to say with a smile on her face, "But very important." And I would echo that. Things like bylaws, policies, those kinds of things, policy governance, it's not exactly exciting work, but it's foundational work. It's very necessary work. And the model that I'm going to be sharing with you in a PowerPoint presentation here today is commonly referred to as the Carver model, created by a man by the name of Carver. In fact, I was privileged to study policy governance under Carver himself in Atlanta, Georgia, some years ago. But policy governance, the Carver model is one of 4 different models for policy governance. And if you are interested in knowing what the others are, you could go to Google it and find what those are. And at the end of this presentation, I'm going to share a couple of resources with you for your continued learning, reading and all, if you should desire to learn more. in a sense, what I'm sharing with you today is kind of like drinking out of a fire hose. I'm going to share a lot of pertinent information, and depending on your background or knowledge of policy governance, it may seem overwhelming. And at first, it is rather overwhelming. It's a different way of thinking than what many of us are thinking. It's a different way of acting and operating as a board than most of us, especially those of us who have come out of the life of the church, have been accustomed to. A part of my career includes pastoral ministry. And in my tenure as a pastor, I know some of the boards with whom I worked operated like a management board. It was like they're in charge, and my job was to preach, to teach, to visit, and to do the clergy related matters, but yet they were the leaders. And so as a result, sometimes decisions were very difficult. I remember sitting in one board meeting as a first-time pastor, and we spent 2 hours or so discussing and debating whether a Toro or a John Deere mower was the better one to purchase. And as you can imagine, at that moment, I was praying for Jesus to return very quickly, thinking to myself, is this what I'm in for the rest of my life? Well, let me just illustrate before I get into the PowerPoint presentation why I think policy governance is so critical. It's so important. In my studies in organizational leadership, and just as my personal observation, I believe that most organizational problems are created or caused by one of two things. Number one, the lack of a system, or secondly, the breakdown of a system. So what we are doing in policy governance is very foundational. It's the infrastructure for how the organization does what it is called to do and seeks to accomplish its mission. So I'm going to illustrate, hopefully, these things as I move into the PowerPoint presentation, which let me begin now. Is that visible?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. Well, here, as you can see from the title, the role of the board utilizing the governance model. And there's several key ideas and concepts that are foundational for policy governance. The first one is there is a sharp distinction is made between management and governance. Dr. Jesus mentioned this a few moments ago. And in essence, the CEO manages and the board governs. And I know for many of us who have come out of not-for-profits, especially in the life of many churches that I have known, that hasn't been the case. But here we make a very sharp distinction between management and governance. A second key idea is the key to the board's role is found in the words policy and governance. And the board governs the activity of the organization via policy. The board does not make the day-to-day management decisions, but we govern via or by way of policy. A third key idea is the word ends. Ends are the result or end product the board expects. The ends are the difference the organization should make in the lives of the people that it serves. Now, when we talk about the ends, under policy governance, basically, you need to think of it this way, that there is a sense, and when we think of MACU, Mid-America, if you were to ask me who owns Mid-America, I would say that the board is the owner. The board has ownership of the organization, because as I remind our board quite frequently, presidents come and presidents go, but the one continuing thing in every not-for-profit is the board of trustees. And so the board, in that sense, owns the organization, the ministry, and is responsible for the ends. We define what it is that we want to see in the lives, in this case, of our students. So that's a very key concept. This fourth one, means. The means are the mechanisms or processes utilized to achieve the ends. And the executive means are the purview of the CEO. So in other words, the board sets the ends. What are the goals? What are the end results? What do we want a student who graduates from our university to be like? And we set those things, and then the president is the one who's responsible for how we get there. So again, you notice that there's a very sharp distinction between management and governance. A fifth key idea is what's referred to as executive limitations. And this is the rules set by the board which establish the boundaries of the CEO's authority. And often they're set as prohibitions. Now, I have led several organizations in creating a governance model, one of which was, I spent a decade in Ohio. I was the state pastor, basically the overseer for the Churches of God in Ohio. And what I inherited was a mess. We had all these different boards, and it seemed like it was difficult to make real decisions to move ahead. So I led us through the process of changing our bylaws and creating a governance policy, a governance manner of operation. A part of that were executive limitations. Think of it this way. Think of it like the boundaries of a football field. You play within the boundaries, and at first blush, it feels like setting limitations on the executive sounds confining. But I can tell you from personal experience, it's freeing, because the safe assumption is that if the board doesn't tell me that I can't do it, then the assumption is that I can. For instance, when I was the state pastor in Ohio, I could go out and borrow money on behalf of the board without the board's authority. However, and here was a safeguard, I had to show the board how I was going to be able to repay it in a certain period of time. In a like fashion, and pardon my continued reference to Mid-America Christian University, but that's my current context. That's what I know best. In a like manner, we have in our policies that our CEO, our president, can borrow money on behalf of the university without the board speaking into it. But again, like in my case, he has to be able to show to us how he's going to repay that and in what period of time. So these prohibitions are actually freeing rather than confining. And so I think that's one of the best things about policy governance is by telling the CEO what you can't do, you can safely assume that unless it's stated as a negative, chances are you can make that decision yourself. Another key idea is monitoring reports. And this is something that the CEO reports to the board, his or her compliance to the policy set out in the executive limitations. So every time that we meet, our president, and again, this is very recent, he submitted to us 2 reports, and he submits these reports to us in advance. And in our case, our governance committee reads these, makes suggestions, and then, if approved, presents them to the board. And these monitoring reports are to show if he or she is in compliance with the policies that we have set out. So it's the way that we hold the president accountable. And whatever your situation, be it an executive director, be it a senior pastor or whatever, it functions in the same way. Here's another key concept. The board has authority over the CEO only as it acts as the board. No individual, not even the chair, has authority over the CEO. In other words, again, using MACU as the example, I am not the president's boss, and no individual on the board is his boss. We are his boss as we act together as the board. Now, there are situations in policy governance where, say, the chairman of the board, or let's say a small group from the board, are given authority by the board to speak into the CEO's, say, inaction or wrong choices, wrong decisions. And in such a case, they can act with authority, but it's only as given by the board. So that's a key concept in my estimation. By the way, let me just add this parenthetical note. The PowerPoint that I'm sharing with you, every fall we have new trustees that come on the board. And we have a new trustee meeting in which the president and the governance committee will share things that the new trustee needs to understand. And one of the things that we go through with the board is the governance process, so that they understand how we operate. Now, ends, let me just say a few things. You remember, if you ever read Stephen Covey's The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, he says one of the habits is to begin with the end in mind. And that's what we are doing in policy governance. We have set the ends, the board has set the ends. These are the end results that we want. These are the end products, or the end product that the board desires. The difference the board wants to see in the people served. And in terms of the language of the 4 disciplines of execution, these are the WIGs. These are the board's WIGs, the wildly important goals we want to achieve. Now, some of you listening and watching today may or may not be aware of the 4 disciplines of execution. If not, that's another thing I would encourage you to become acquainted with. MACU lives by the 4 disciplines of execution. And these WIGs are wildly important goals by definition. Usually the organization will have 3 or 4 goals. Peter Drucker, the great management guru from some years ago, said that any organization or any individual that has 5 or more goals has no goals, because it becomes too complex. You're trying to juggle. It's like being a juggler. You're trying to juggle too many balls. So we keep it simple, and we identify what we consider to be the most important end results that we desire. Now, let me just get even a little more personal and share with you MACU's ends policies. And again, Dr. Jesus and Dr. Kelly will be very familiar with these. And if any of you from our MACU, you may be aware of what these end policies are. And these are the ends policies of the board. And the first one, 4.1, our students will have a greater encounter with God that leads to a spiritual commitment to Christ, a commitment to Christian discipleship, and a commitment to Holy Spirit-filled living. And again, our president shows us evidences of what he and staff and faculty are doing to influence and to lead the student in the direction of this happening in his or her life. Another end policy, 4.2, our students will have a greater engagement in learning that prepares them to create, collaborate, and innovate in solving local and global problems. And one of the things that makes me proud of MACU is it's truly a global university. with, I believe, I heard 42 nations represented. So we're preparing people not just to lead in the United States, but literally around the world. And 4.3 says our students will have a greater understanding of and emphasis on local and global issues. Notice that the emphasis, not just local, but includes global as well. And then finally, 4.4 says our students will have a greater expression of doing good that reflects the life and ministry of Jesus Christ. So these 4 ends are ends that the board has put into place that we want to see happen in the lives of our students. And whatever it is that your not-for-profit is, and if you undergo a change, say, into policy governance, your board will want to identify what's the end product. Beginning with end in mind, what is the end that we seek to accomplish as an organization? And talk a bit about MACU's executive limitations. Now, in this report, the CEO gives her or his interpretation of his understanding of the board's policies and how she has fulfilled them. So, like in our recent board meeting, our president gave us 2 reports. The first was these executive limitations, proving that he has fulfilled, and then the other one was the monitoring report, in which he reports on how well he has done in terms of leading us to the desired ends. Now, for instance, just to, again, I told you that this is going to be pretty personal from the standpoint that I'm using MACU as an example. And in the executive limitations that we have policies on treatment of students, treatment of faculty and staff, asset protection, compensation and benefits, communication and support to the board. And so our president is held accountable to these things. And so he has to report to the board how he is doing in terms of each of these policies that we have. And let me go back and just kind of reiterate something I said a few moments ago. And that is usually when there are organizational issues, it's because of either a lack of a system or the breakdown of a system. And so I simply say that again to emphasize the importance of doing the infrastructure work, of having at your foundation a good set of bylaws, good sets of policy manuals, and just the various things that we need to function effectively and to accomplish our mission. Now, there are several key players in governance, and let me just mention who some of those are. The first one is the owner or owners. Who is the owner or owners? Now, if this was a public corporation, and it would be the stockholders, and the board serves somewhat as their representation. There's the board, which has total responsibility for the institution. And again, let me just share with you something that I say to the board with great frequency, and I kind of referred to it a few moments ago. And I mentioned a few moments ago that presidents come and presidents go, but the one continuing thing in the life of a not-for-profit is the board. And something that I mentioned to our board with a measure of frequency is that who is, I asked the question, who's responsible for MACU? And some people might say, well, the president. And I would say, not really. We, the board, have ultimate total fiduciary responsibility for the university. And so whatever your not-for-profit happens to be, your board has the same ultimate total fiduciary responsibility for the ministry or the organization. That's a key point. That's a key thing to remember. Just to share with you, and something that I saw some years ago, and this is going back, I don't know, 20 or 30 years maybe. Some of you may recall that some years ago, the company Kmart filed for some one of the bankruptcies. I forget, it's 11 or 13, whichever it was that they applied for. And I happened to see an interview online of one of the board members at Kmart who said this: 2 weeks before we filed for bankruptcy, we, the board, did not know we were in financial problems. And my response to that, I was sharing this with the board in our meeting last week. And I said these words: shame on them. The board was not doing its job, because again, who has ultimate responsibility for the organization, for the ministry, or for the not-for-profit? And the answer is the board. So I don't think we can emphasize enough how serious a matter this is, and how the board needs to be engaged. One of the things that MACU is experiencing this fall is the Higher Learning Commission is going to be on campus and for the review. And I've heard a lot of people at MACU say, thank goodness it doesn't happen every year. But one of the things that they are going to do is to speak with some of us board members, because they want to know if we are doing our job. Do we know what's going on here? And that's one of the key functions that they're looking for, and that we must assume as the board. Other key players: the CEO. The board delegates its responsibility for the organization to the CEO. So we, again, govern, he manages, and so we give him our authority to manage the day-to-day affairs of the institution. There's the staff and employees, and the CEO hires and fires employees, and they're ultimately responsible to him or her alone. One of the things, I served as the chairman of the Ministries Council of the Church of God some years ago, and we had just gone into policy governance ourselves. And I asked this question of the Ministries Council. There probably were 30 or more people in the room. I said, how many employees do we have? And they were making guesses: 50, 60, 80. The numbers were all over the map. And finally, after they quit guessing, I held up one finger. We, the Ministers Council, have but one employee, and we as the Board of Trustees at MACU have but one employee, and that's the CEO. Everybody else who works in the place for the ministry are his employees. Another key player are the customers. And I think one of the things that we all have to identify in our not-for-profits: who is our customer? Who is it that we're called to serve? And these are the ones who are the recipients of the product or services of the organization. So again, using MACU as the example, the customers would be the students. That's why we're there. We're there because of them. We're there to serve them. We're there to prepare them. And here's a question, just to kind of frame it a bit different, since again, I think to a certain extent, this is kind of like drinking out of a fire hose. But how do we frame this in a way that all of us can understand it? In other words, make it somewhat simplified. And that is to use a sports metaphor. And I like football, perhaps many others who are watching online like football as well. And let me just say, when we think of when we use policy governance and use a sports metaphor, metaphors can only be pushed to a certain extent. Metaphors, if you push them too far, will begin to collapse. But I think that the metaphor that I have chosen here is an effective one, is a good one for helping us to understand. And so in this case, this is football versus governance. In the game of football, there are several people, groups, and things that identify and make up the game of football. And of course, that would be true of any other sport. There's the owner, which I would argue in the case of MACU is the board. And I would say to you in your not-for-profit, who is the owner of your ministry or your organization? There's the coach, who is the CEO, the person that we have hired and commissioned to manage the organization. There are the players. And I would argue that these are the CEO staff. These are the faculty, the staff, all the people who work for the organization. And then there are the officials. And I would argue, in using this metaphor, that the officials are the board. And now in the game of football, the officials don't make up the rules, which so a difference here, and this is where you can only push a metaphor so far. In this case, we as the board have made the rules. And the fans, the people in the stands, are the membership and those to be reached. And I would argue, again, in the case of university, these are the students and their families. So taking this a little further, the playing field equals the executive limitations that have been set by the board. In the executive limitations, we define the playing field. And remember, going back to what I said a little earlier, we typically identify the limitations in the way of negative statements. You can't this, you can't that. So the coach understands, hopefully clearly, what his or her, what are the limits of his or her authorities and what he or she can do. And then there's the rule book, which is the board's policy manual. So this is one way to just kind of distinguish, you know, how we play the game, so to speak. And so let me just add a few other things here and related to the board's job. First of all, to make sure the game is played according to the rules. And to throw the flag in the event the rules are broken. If someone is clipped, someone's offside, it's our job to blow the whistle and to administer the penalty. Now, let me say in terms of the board's actions itself. I recall a board meeting a few years ago when there were several voices in the room who said, I think we need to, our president needs to do whatever the situation was and whatever it was that they felt that the president needed to do. And at that time, I was the chair of the governance committee, and I basically threw the flag, blew the whistle, and said, that is not our place to tell him what to do. And again, go back to what I said in the beginning. We make a very sharp distinction between governance and management. Our purview are the policies and the rules, if you will. His purview are the means, how he chooses to carry out the ends that we have identified. And it is never to tell the coach what plays to call or to interfere in his role as a coach. You know, if we were watching a football game and we saw, you know, one of the referees on the side go over to the coach and say, I want you to run this play, we would say foul. That's not his job. His job is to make sure that we play within the rules and to blow the flag, to throw the flag, blow the whistle, if and only if the rules have been broken. It is not to tell the coach what play to call. That we wouldn't accept that in football, and under policy governance. We can't accept that either. Now, I'm going to stop here. I think that I've gone probably about 20 or 25 minutes here. Let me just share with you some additional information. Here's a good article on the governance model. It's rather lengthy, but you may want to go to that link if interested in reading more. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that this was written by Carver himself. And also the book that Carver wrote, Boards That Make a Difference. If you really want to get into the weeds, so to speak, get into depth, that's probably one of the best things that you can read, is read Carver's book itself. And so, and there are many other resources. Again, I mentioned earlier that the Carver model is but one of 4 different models. So, you know, you might want to read up on some of the others, but this is the essence of what the Carver model, how it operates. And let me just say as a final statement, I do not consider myself by any stretch an expert in policy governance. At best, I would call myself a practitioner. I know enough about it to practice it and to, you know, put it in place and so forth. But if you really want to become, know more, you know, here are 2 resources that I'm giving you that you might want to check into. So, Dr. Jesus, Dr. Kelly, that's the end of what I have to share.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Spence. Really appreciate what a wonderful way to present this, what I would rather call a thick topic in such an easy way to understand. I like the idea of the fact that you focused on MACU of our university as an example, because what I found down the road is that a lot of people, when they go through these things, they end up asking, can you give me an example on how it looks like? Because that's where the tough part is. And so basically people that joined us today are certainly went through not only a great explanation of what the Carver model and is all about, but also how it can be applied from a practical point of view. We went through a case study. And that's really, really valuable. Thank you so much. So we're opening now the time for Q&A. If anybody wants to share any questions or any things that you might think would be valuable for you to grow as you try to process these and try to implement these. And we'll begin trying to hear. In the meantime, Kelly, feel free to join in if you have any comment or any question for Dr. Spence.
Yes, this might be a novice question because I've never served on a board. I've studied a little about governance and certainly have helped healthcare organizations in this area. And one of the things that they've focused in on a lot is risk management policies. How important is that in a non-for-profit environment?
You know, to a brief response to that, I think it's very important. And I know that that's one of the things, you know, especially from a financial perspective, that the board has set into place some policies in regards to risk management, financial, fiduciary risk management. Because again, this is, you know, us trying as a board, trying to exercise our ultimate and final fiduciary responsibility for the university. And so we have set in place certain things, certain policies to minimize our risk of exposure. And, you know, for instance, funds that we have set aside for emergency purposes. We've stated to the president basically what he can and cannot do. And what funds in such a situation, what funds will he tap and in what order. So I think the better you think through these things, the more policies you have in place. They're not impediments, but they're guidelines. And, some people see policies as impediments. I see them as safety measures, as guides to make sure that we don't go off the rail. We don't take the organization someplace that we don't want to go.
Always about reducing liability.
Yes.
Yes, and I like the way you mentioned it in the presentation, Dr. Spence, that you say instead of those limitations being only seen as prohibitions, there are somehow boundaries that end up freeing the CEO for things. So it means that when an organization is within a policy governance commitment and implements most of these things and perform, then I think one of the key things that emerge is that there's such a clarity in terms of what are the roles of each one of the players, just like as you shared in that metaphor, which, by the way, I think it's interesting to see each one. And so we need, from a strategic point of view, to set up the guidelines for what we expect to finish up, what's the end line, so the ends and then the means, but at the same time, the expectations that the board has to be put together. And that's, I think, in my case, I don't know if you see that way, but that's one of the biggest challenges for boards, to set up, to write down, to sit and write down the policies, the bylaws, and to be really intentional and to then play by those rules that they have set up for themselves, and then move forward in that direction, and then creating, I like the way you also mentioned that this is somehow creating this infrastructure to accomplish the mission of the organization. I love that. We're still open for more questions. I think there's some.
We have two more. We have two questions.
Yes. So Morgan is asking, since the average church size is about 75, how can using a governance model benefit a local congregation?
Hi, Morgan. This becomes difficult in the life of the church. In some cases, or in most cases, when of churches of about 75 in number, the board, has become so accustomed to being a management board that making that leap is a difficult one. I think, number one, they have to have in place a pastor whom they trust, who's not going to drive the church off the rails. In fact, somewhat humorously, I had a board member when I was a state pastor in Ohio. My job was to travel around to churches, meet with boards, etc. And I had a board member actually tell me that he felt like that the job of the board was to protect the church from the pastor. And unfortunately, that is the reality in many churches. That's what the board member would see their purposes being. So I think in smaller churches, it is more difficult. Oftentimes, and the pastor does not have any management experience. One of the things that I have observed about ministers in general is that we tend not to be very business minded. We're not, that's not a part of our training per se. And we don't think in that fashion. One of our board members at MACU recently said to me, he said, "You think like a businessman." And I think that that's a true statement, but the reality is most pastors don't. So in some cases, policy governance would be a difficult one to pull off if the church doesn't feel like they can give a responsibility to the pastor to make the calls, to manage the organization. I know in my case, when I went into the churches that I pastored, in my first church, technically I didn't have permission to go buy postage stamps without permission of the board. Through exercise of my leadership, eventually they gave me more and more responsibility and allowed me more authority. But it wasn't something that I forced. It was something that they gave. And I think that true leadership is going to rise to the surface. And if a pastor has within himself or herself leadership capabilities, that that there's a good chance that will happen. The current church that I serve as executive pastor, I had a board member tell me, you guys think you're in charge, but you're not. We, the board, are the ones making the decisions. I didn't argue with them. We just went out and improved things differently. And so today, as time has lapsed, the board looks to the executive leadership of the church for making decisions. And so without posing a revolution, we have gained more authority and, if you will, more power to actually lead. But it's been by example. And so I would say in a church of 75, I think the governance model, you can begin to act in that fashion. And I think in time, perhaps if the pastor proves himself or herself, that there can be an evolution of sorts.
Great. Wonderful. Thank you. Yeah. A big topic for the majority of churches, right? So there's one last question here that we have from Chris. And the question is, the presenter shared about the Carver model. What other models exist? So it's someone interested in knowing more about if there are other models that you might be happy to do it.
Hi, Chris. I think the quick answer is I don't have those other models readily in mind, but what you could do is just do a Google search, just search out, policy governance. I know the link to the article that I've shared, I got on Google myself, I think it was yesterday. And I noticed there was a link to something about the 4 models of policy governance. So I would just suggest that you do a Google search and find out what the others are. The only one that I really know is the Carver model.
Wonderful. Thanks for clarifying that. And I have found that the Carver model is increasingly being used by more and more nonprofit organizations. And it's something that have definitely brought, as you stated in the beginning, a change of mentality to approach the interaction between board CEOs and the customers. And so it's always interesting to dig deeper into this one and to have a wider view. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Spence. We're really honored. I think everybody that is part of this webinar today are living with a greater perspective of how not only here at MACU we're run by, but at the same time, the strategic thinking as we as leaders intend to move organizations into the future and to make sure that we are part of that sustainability of the organization, especially the challenges that most nonprofits go through. Well, before we finish up today, I wanted to mention just something really brief. And let me see if I can move here. So our School of Business Leadership is committed to equipping leaders in the nonprofit world as well. And most people think that we only offer for those who are in the business world, but also we have a commitment to helping people grow in their leadership skills. And we do that by offering different kinds of areas of emphasis, specialties, and we have a commitment to mentor closely students as we move them forward in their academic and professional careers. And 2 examples of those are the programs that Dr. Kelly and I have the privilege to be program directors for. In my case, is the Master of Arts in Leadership that is designed to equip those who want to be transformative, visionary, global, and servant leaders in a variety of organizational settings. And we want to make sure that people go deeper into the understandings of what leadership foundations are all about, but at the same time, and through a worldview that may be biblical as they lead. And we do that by innovative and collaborative learning approaches in all that we do. And at the same time, together with the Master of Arts, the Masters of Business Administration, the MBA led by Dr. Kelly, which, by the way, is consistently ranked as one of the state's best degree programs. We have the honor to say that. And so we have many options. I would encourage each one of you to explore in detail in our website, as we offer many options for those of you who want to be equipped in these kind of programs. And make sure you follow us on social media and share with us if you liked anything that you heard today. And if you want to even go beyond by going back to this webinar and sharing the recordings, or even joining future ones, make sure that you do. And you can check on our social media and our website and contact us and let us know about what you think about what you're experiencing and seeing through these events. And if you're interested in any of our programs, we'll be more than glad to be in contact with you and provide you with that information. So, Dr. Kelly, what a wonderful time we had. And do you have any words before we close?
Well, thank you, Dr. Spence. And it was just such an honor to have you here with us today and to learn from you. Really a vital part of our life at MACU, the backbone, the brain, the whole thing, or a sports analogy where we're all a team, and you're the owners and also the officials. So we thank you so much for your time. I want to remind everybody that if you would like to share this or to look to review it again and take a deeper look, the link to this will be at macu.edu/leadership-connection. And please fill out the feedback at the end of this, and that will make you eligible for a special gift from our school. And we look forward to seeing you again next month for another wonderful conversation.
Yes, I'm just sharing the link so everyone can know and checked on it, and we'll be posting this webinar really soon there, and be in the lookout for the next one and the following ones that we're going to be sharing. Thank you, Dr. Kelly. Thank you, Dr. Spence. And I hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all for coming.